I'm a parent here in Chelmsford. I have 2 little kids. One is in 1st grade at Byam Elementary, and my youngest is actually going to be 3 in just 2 days, so they're real little. But I have been spending lots of time, unfortunately, researching, looking into, spending tons of hours at night and learning about Common Core for a very long time. And, you know, I really reached a point, sort of the beginning of this year, early in 2014, where you have to do more. You know, you learn so much that you get to a point where you really just are looking for other people to talk to and network with, and what can we do. And so I was fortunate to meet Donna, standing in the back, who had done a forum very similar to this with Jamie, Gass, and Sandra Stotsky in Northborough, and she was putting together a group, you know, of a way for other people to find each other and network and talk and share information and help educate each other. And so that's how we started Common Core Forum. And this is what we do. We're just parents and teachers that volunteer our time together to just help one another understand what Common Core is, what are all the pieces that we're hearing about, how does it become, you know, a part of our system, where is it going, what does it mean, and just be a resource for each other. And so, you know, today really had a lot to do with Sandy Martinez, because she lives here in town, and then I met her now that I've become pretty tenacious when it comes to finding out about where people stand on Common Core. And so I asked her one day, when I just met her, well, do you know about Common Core? What do you think about it? And was really shocked at how much she knew about it. And since then, I've been sort of talking a lot about how can we educate this area in particular that, you know, we live in, and so we were very fortunate, because it's hard to get on schedules with Peg Luksik and Jamie and other people. So it's a real testament to everybody that's here to take a time out of your Sunday to learn something about this, because it's always changing, it's always evolving. And whether you know a lot or a little or nothing at all about Common Core, there's always something new to learn. Sometimes just somebody talking about it and saying it a little differently, maybe you sort of knew it, it clarifies something you didn't quite understand before. And so it's great to come and learn and share. So what I'd like to do is just, you know, move on to everybody. So I'm going to, you know, have Sandy come up and talk about, you know, what she knows about it, how long she's been fighting things like this, and then we'll get to Jamie and Peg. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Shannon. This came together so easily. I'm amazed at how many people are actually here today and not home watching the Patriots. I'm so pleased that we're able to present this to all of you. How many of you here know a lot about Common Core? How many of you here know nothing about it and are here to learn? Great. I hope we address both of your issues or your knowledge with what we're going to present today. I wanted to start today with how I became involved with this issue, and it was back in 1993. Way back then. I became the state director for an organization called Concerned Women for America, and I served in that position for 11 years. And one of the big things back then was the onset of something called outcomes-based education. And I started digging, like Shannon's been digging, what is this? What does it mean? And I began talking to parents across the country and said, what's your state doing with this? Because it was going state by state, much like Common Core is. And so I went to Arizona to a friend of mine out there, and she gave me the name of parents in other states. I got in touch with them, and I asked them all, send me what your state's outcomes are, or whatever they call them. Some places call them outcomes, some call them strands, but they were all designed to achieve a purpose with a child and his education system. I spent the whole summer at the pool when my kids were tiny, they were taking swimming lessons, with my box of responses from parents across the country. And they're still in my file cabinet in my basement if anybody would like to see them. But I spent all that time reading it and trying to understand it. And during that process, I found out about a woman named Peg Luksik, who had done a video back then called Who Controls the Children? And I really became excited to know more about Peg and what she'd been doing. And she had been fighting this longer than I have, I think. But what I learned is that this is not your children, what we knew, what we grew up with education. It's totally, totally different. And I first became aware that Chelmsford was engaged in this when I went to a school committee meeting and our school superintendent, Dr. Moser, how many here are from Chelmsford? How many remember Dr. Moser? Anyway, he came back from a seminar. He'd been out in Colorado for a whole week studying at the feet of a fellow named Bill Spady, who supposedly was the father of outcome-based education. And I was listening to this woman sitting next to me, and she goes, "Oh, this is so wonderful." And I thought, well, if she likes it, it can't be all that good, because we were diametrically opposed on our views on certain educational things. So I decided to look into it more, and that's how I kind of hooked up with Peg and hooked up with all these other parents across the nation. I invited Peg Luksik to come to Massachusetts when I put on one of my first statewide conventions, because I knew she was an expert at that point in time. She was the only person I knew except for Charlotte Iserbeat from Maine. They both had come down to speak at my convention. At the end of this particular convention, a little old man comes up to me in the foyer and he said, "Sandy, I'm with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and my partner, my girlfriend, is from Russia. She and I left Russia. We left Russia because of this kind of education." So he heard Peg talk, he heard the things that we were presenting that day, and this was 1995. He was concerned about the future of America's education. And it goes on from there. It's worn many hats, and I'm sure Peg will address those. Let's see. Right now, Massachusetts did a marvelous thing. When we implemented our MCAS system, I was one of the few parents that would not let my children participate until I knew more about it because of what I'd learned, what was going on with the education system. But I had friends that were teachers, and they were being asked to give input into our outcomes. And I believe they did a very, very good job. And Massachusetts currently has probably the best education system in the country. And I eventually did let my children take the MCAS when they got into high school, and I learned that I didn't have to worry because we had done a good job with the implementation of it. I'm really concerned when I'm hearing what Common Core is doing. There's no teacher input. From what I've been talking to teachers all over the state, they're not being asked, what do you think about this math section, or this English section, or this history section? And I'm going to let others go into that more and more. Basically, my take on all of this is that Common Core and the PART is the government takeover of education. They're ripping control out of your hands as parents. They're ripping control out of the teachers' hands. How many here are teachers? Do you feel like you're being robbed of your opportunity to direct the classroom as you see fit, to direct the education of the children under you? I know the teachers that I've talked to are saying, we're losing control completely. It's being turned over to this system, this behemoth. So anyway, I think one of the other big problems with this is it's costing the towns, the cities and towns, millions of dollars. It's a very, very expensive system, and I don't know about your towns, but I know Chelmsford and other towns are struggling just to pay their bills. We have, the schools to fund, we have the city workers, the town workers, the police, the fire, and we have so many unfunded mandates that this is just another unfunded mandate, and I think it's a real problem for the cities and towns of Massachusetts. I'm running for the state senate because I believe that our education in Massachusetts should be number one. It has been number one, and I want to see it remain number one. I have an opponent who supports Common Core. He has not spoken out against it, he will not speak out against it, and he believes that it's just a wonderful thing. Right there, that's one reason why I'm hoping and asking that people will listen to what we say today And they'll go away with the idea that we need change. And the only way we're going to get change is by changing the legislature. Because the legislature are the ones that vote this stuff in. And we need to change that. Let's see, I think I'm just about done. I was very excited to hear the other day that several of the unions are calling for a 2 or 3 year pause or a moratorium on this new unfunded high-stakes testing. Our 3rd Middlesex district is currently the highest taxed district in the whole state. I looked it up, and 7 of my 9 towns are in the top 10. And my towns consist of Bedford, Carlisle, Chelmsford, Concord, Lexington, Lincoln, Sudbury, Weston, and Waltham. Weston is got the highest taxes in the whole state, and probably in the country, because it's one of the richest cities in the country. And the parents there is just as concerned as we are here in Chelmsford and other places. So I hope that you'll join me, and I hope you'll listen to Peg, and I hope you'll take really, really good notes. We're videotaping, and we're going to encourage everybody, if you want to take out your cameras and you want to tape any of this, I don't think anybody objects. I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon. I'm going to let Shannon introduce our special guests.
So we're going to start and have Jamie Gass speak first. Jamie is Pioneer Institute Director of the Center for School Reform. Jamie has had more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state and municipal levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability as Senior Policy Analyst, Technical Writer, and in the State Budget Office under 2 Massachusetts governors. I'm going to go on. I like to brag about him. In the 1990s, Jamie worked for the Dean of the Boston University School of Education, Boston University Management Team, in its historic partnership with the Chelsea Public Schools. He has appeared on numerous Greater Boston media outlets, as well as talk radio across the country. He has been quoted in The Economist, Education Week, and the Boston Globe, and his op-eds are regularly published in Boston and regional newspapers, as well as educational journals. Jamie speaks on school choice, academic standards, and school district accountability at events throughout the country. Please join me in welcoming Jamie Gass.
Is that working, or is it on?
I think it's just for the camera.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank Shannon and Donna and Dean and others and all of you for coming out this afternoon and listening to, I think, what is an interesting topic. I mean, we're pretty engaged in it in the last 4 or 5 years or so. But let me give you just a little bit of context of what Common Core is, because some of you may or may not know what it's all about, even though the Commonwealth and 40-some-odd states have now adopted it. So Common Core is a set of English and math standards that were developed by the National Governors Association, which represents the governors of each state, not the states. And then the Council of Chief State School Officers, which represents the commissioners of education for each state, not the states. These are 2 Washington, D.C. based trade groups. The funding for the development of Common Core came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and you folks all know who Bill Gates is. He was the founder and CEO of Microsoft, and he now heads up a $40 billion foundation that has been funding a lot of work over the last 10, 15 years in K-12 education. Before I begin, though, I want to give you a little preface from someone who knows a great deal more about the intent of this country and what it's all about. And that's James Madison, who's the founding father that we call the father of the Constitution, and he was the drafter of the Bill of Rights. If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I would venture to declare it as my opinion. It would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people of America. So I think the Founding Fathers were very wise. They understood that the national government, the federal government, has certain responsibilities, trade, foreign policy, and defense, and the like. But that most of the more domestic-oriented interests that touch the lives of school children and citizens, things like public education, are the proper legal jurisdiction of states and localities. The fact is that even after the last 50 years, which there's been a steady growth of federal control and influence and money around K-12 education, the fact is that 90% of the funding for K-12 education still comes from the state and local level. Right? And this is what the founders envisioned. They envisioned K-12 education as being a wellspring for the development of citizens, first and foremost, to help perpetuate the ideals of our democracy and our republic. But they intended the teachers and the principals and the parents, people at the local level, to make the decisions that most intimately connect those children with the lives of the country. Right? If you go back to the 1830s, you go back to the turn of the 19th century, French commentators like Alexis de Tocqueville, he wrote a famous 2-volume book called Democracy in America, describing what was unique about this country, about the United States, as we were emerging just a few decades after our founding. And what he was struck by when he visited this country was that unlike Europe, unlike so many of the countries, not only in recent memory, but going back to antiquity, that the decision-making really came up from the people, that policies didn't often actually come from government, it came from citizens and their opinions and the input that they're able to have and provide to their into their government. And this is unique, right? It's throughout Europe, we all know the examples of this. Kings and queens and ministers and layers of sort of court officials making decisions that impact the lives of their subjects, really. And how different this country is. A lot of us know that our forefathers, in one way, shape, or form, came to this country to escape a lot of that. They came here to be able to exert a degree of freedom. And I think that, educating children is probably the greatest expression of liberty and freedom in which we all cherish. So this system of federalism, the federal government does certain things, the state governments do other things. This has actually served our country quite well. In the last 200 plus years, we've gone from really a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to the most powerful country in the world. I mean, this is no small accomplishment, and it was not inevitable. It was hard won by certainly the founding fathers, but successive generations of people that made enormous sacrifices, whether it was sacrifices for civil rights or sacrifices fighting for our interests here and abroad. I mean, these are hard-won liberties. They don't come easily, and they're lost easily if we're not vigilant about it. But the reality of it is that, while the country used to be one of the highest performing countries in the world in terms of K-12 education, sometime in the decades immediately following World War II, we began to notice some slippage. The first sort of shot across the bow was in the late 1950s during the space race with Sputnik 1, where the Soviets were able to put this satellite into orbit. And everyone began to say, wow, we're behind. We got to begin to catch up. We're not developing the scientists and the engineers and the mathematicians that we're going to need to compete in the space race. But by the early 1980s, there was a commission that was put together by President Reagan and his U.S. Department of Education, and they authored a report. It's called The Nation at Risk. This exhaustive report laid out in line and verse what I think a lot of people had suspected for a long time, is that we had been slipping, and we've been slipping pretty dramatically. We were basically had fallen to about 11th or 17th, depending on whether you're talking about the English and the humanities or whether you're talking about math and science. We were no longer considered among the top tier countries in the world. And specifically, this Nation at Risk report was very clear that we needed to do something pretty dramatic to improve the quality of public education if we were going to be able to compete in the 21st century with countries like Germany and Japan and China and India and South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore. But what that report did not do was come up with lots of top-down prescriptions from Washington, D.C. on how to solve these problems. Because again, everybody across the political spectrum for decades has known that K-12 education is the proper legal and financial jurisdiction of the states and localities. Okay? So gradually through the 80s, there were a variety of different reforms that came down. What was interesting, and Peg will talk about it in some detail, and Sandy sort of referenced it, is that around this time, there were a group of Washington, D.C. based trade groups. They're lobbying groups, the Governor's Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, some of the teachers' unions. They really thought, going back to at least the 80s, that the way to solve these problems was to have a set of national standards, tests, and curriculum. They were all from Washington, D.C. In fact, that was really the unstated goal when the U.S. Department of Education was set up in 1979. There were lots of limits, which I'll talk a little bit about that later, but the people that advocated for it then, some of them are now the chair of the Board of Education in Massachusetts, right? They've long believed that we need to emulate Europe and other countries and have a set of national standards and testing and curriculum that's the same for all the states. What I'm going to tell you a little bit about is what Massachusetts did, because what Massachusetts did was not only historic, but it has proven to be historically successful. So, by the early 1990s, even Massachusetts, which was considered a higher performing state for many, many years, public education embedded in our Constitution, written by John Adams in 1780, and even through the 1830s with Horace Mann, who's sort of the founding father of public education. Massachusetts was always known as a state that was a very, very well-educated state and a leader in public education. But even by the early 1990s, we had fallen. We were basically around middle of the pack on the SAT, right, in both reading and in mathematics. So we too, like the rest of the country, had fallen pretty dramatically. And what happened is that Bill Weld, who was a moderate to liberal Republican governor, got together with Tom Birmingham, who was a pretty liberal Democrat. He had a strong relationship with organized labor. He's a labor lawyer. Mark Roosevelt, also a pretty liberal Democrat with great relationship with organized labor. And I mention that not as a way to identify politicians. What I'm trying to show is that there was broad bipartisan consensus among these players that something dramatic needed to be done, which is in fact what happened. So in 1993, these three political players set up and crafted legislation called the Massachusetts Education Reform Act. And what it really was a grand bargain of a great deal of additional state resources, which they called Chapter 70, and then a minimum threshold that each of the localities all had to spend. So so the localities couldn't go below a certain threshold. It's really a desire to make sure that there was equitable funding at two levels, really. And since that time, since 1993, we have spent well over $100 billion, and that's billion with a B. Okay? In exchange for the enormous amount of treasure, Massachusetts did all the hard things that I think had really eluded the rest of the country over the previous decades. So first and foremost, we were going to have a high-stakes test for graduation, and you all know that as MCAS, the MCAS test. And it was going to be coupled with the standards, academic standards. We weren't going to do fuzzy math. We weren't going to do self-esteem math. We weren't going to have kids write about how they felt about math. They weren't going to do all the things, all these kind of faddish things that everyone kind of knows about and maybe unfortunately experienced, right? We weren't going to do that anymore. That is what led to the decline, not only in Massachusetts, but in the country. We were going to ground it back in high-quality academic standards based in English and math, and science and history. That means, guess what? English teachers are going to teach English. They're going to teach poetry and literature and drama. And of course, those texts matter because the quality of the words and vocabulary, the sentence structure, the plot, the development of these characters, all of this matters enormously. It's better than what these sort of soft skills fads have been blowing through education for decades. It's also important, too, because when children are reading Huckleberry Finn, for example, and they're learning about Huck and his relationship with Jim, a runaway slave, they're learning about things like friendship, right? They're learning these kind of character traits that we want our children to know, to be good people, and to be good citizens, right? These are the things that bind us together as human beings. It's particularly important in a country like this that is not organized by, in many instances, a common language, or a common religion, etc. These connective tissues that are found in stories are really what bind us together as human beings. They help our children understand human nature. So regardless of whether you want to go into business or you want to go into politics or whatever you want to do in life, you've got to know something about human nature. And the way you're going to learn about human nature is through stories, because as a recent author has described it, human beings are the storytelling animal. So stories, they matter. They matter for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which is the shaping of the character of our kids. Right? In the area of mathematics, again, we aren't going to do the fuzzy math, we aren't going to do all the faddish stuff that didn't work. We're going to ground it back in the evidence from high-performing countries, the Hong Kongs, the Singapores, these kinds of South Korea, these countries that for decades everyone said you got to compete with those countries to compete in the 21st century. So what they did in Massachusetts was have Algebra 1, which is the gateway for all higher level mathematics, in the 8th grade. That's what they do in all the high-performing countries in the world. And that's what we did. That's what California did also around the same time. We're going to make sure that kids had access to Algebra 1 because you're never going to get to pre-calculus and calculus and trigonometry, all the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. You're never going to get to that high-level math if you don't have mastery of Algebra 1. And it's a progression. It's a ruthless progression. You got to have it. And that's what Massachusetts did. We did the same thing in the area of science, and we did the same thing here in the area of history. The history one is a sort of sad chapter because it never got implemented. The fact is, in 2009, the Board of Education killed off the history standards and the history MCAS test. So that's just sitting on a shelf at the Department of Education. So, it's the money in exchange for the high-stakes test, high-quality academic standards, right? So, the reality of it is, while the rest of the country in the last 20 years is still stuck in the stagnation and decline that was outlined in that Nation at Risk report, Massachusetts is shot to the absolute top of the heap, right? So there's a test called the NAEP. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a nation's report card. Every state takes it. They take it every 2 years. And it is it's the nation's report card. This is the gold standard. This is how we measure the competitiveness of other states against each other. No state in the history of the test, which had been around about 35 or 40 years, no state had ever been #1 on every category tested. So they have both reading and mathematics, and they test in the 4th and 8th grade. No state had ever been #1 in every grade tested in every category. Guess what state did it? Massachusetts. It did it in 2005. It did it in 2007, 2009, 2011, and 2013. This is an enormous, enormous accomplishment of the teachers, the principals, the lawmakers, the Board of Ed, the Department of Ed, everybody. This is something that we can rightfully be proud of as a state. It's a remarkable accomplishment that exceeded everybody's expectations back in 1993 about what could be possible. I mean, I always say that it's like winning the World Series 5 times in a row and doing it in 4 games straight each time. Remarkable, remarkable. But that Nation at Risk report in 1983 made it clear that for the 21st century, you got to compete internationally. It's not just beating Arkansas and Mississippi and Alabama and a bunch of low-performing states. That's not what the goal is. The goal is to compete internationally. So what did Massachusetts do in 2007? And it did it again in 2013. It was one of only 2 states to test as its own individual country on a test called the TIMSS test, which is the gold standard for international math and science test. And the 2007 test for TIMSS, Massachusetts 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science. Remarkable, remarkable. And we were in the top 4 in the area of mathematics. Remarkable. And then we did that again in 2013. If being #1 on the nation's report card is like winning the World Series, this is like winning 2 Olympic gold medals. This is internationally competitive. It's achieving everything that the people who set up the ed reform law and the taxpayers who spent the $100 billion were hoping was going to happen, and that no one dreamed was possible, and we did it. So that's the good news. The bad news is that in 2009, there was a federal grant program called the Race to the Top. It was initiated by the Obama administration and the U.S. Department of Education. Well, in Massachusetts, we knew that the Race to the Top was really the race to beat Massachusetts. And what happened is that in this federal grant program, so it's a $4.3 billion federal grant program, the federal government baked into that grant program, in order to compete for those federal dollars, you had to sign on to a list of national policy priorities. Well, the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers were already en route developing the Common Core. So what the Obama administration did was dump Common Core and signing on to Common Core into a federal grant program. There are a bunch of other items that were added on there, including teacher evaluations, signing on to national testing, data collection. A lot of priorities in there that were really kind of passed through here in Massachusetts in the summer of 2010. So when most people were at the beach and relaxing and barbecuing and having a good time, that's when the State Board of Education thought it'd be a really good idea to ditch the historic standards on which our historic accomplishments had been based. There wasn't really much discussion. There were no hearings. There were no bills in the state legislature. It was just kind of done. And we got the $250 million from the Obama administration. Again, remember, we are spending $9 billion annually at the state and local level, and have been doing that going back for 20 years. So $250 million is certainly a lot of money, but it's a drop in the bucket. It's an eyedropper in a bucket in comparison to what we've already spent and what we will continue to be spending. Okay? So Pioneer Institute, where I work for, it's an independent, nonpartisan, privately funded research organization. We have not accepted any money from any deep-pocketed foundations to do the work that we've done on Common Core. 75–80% of our funding comes from individual donors, right? We're researchers. We've been around for about 20 some odd years or so, and we're really known for laying out facts and data and research and having it independently reviewed and calling it like we see it, right? Irrespective of whose ox it's scoring. So, given that Massachusetts was the state that they had to put that trophy on the mantelpiece so that all the other states would fall in line to adopt Common Core, we thought, hey, someone ought to take a look at the quality of standards. So what we did is we enlisted a woman named Sandra Stotsky, who had worked on the standards in Massachusetts, but she had also worked on the standards in Texas, in Indiana, and a variety of other states. We coupled her together with a guy named Jim Milgram, who's a professor of mathematics. He's an internationally renowned mathematician at Stanford University, who also, in his spare time, worked on the very high-quality math standards in California, which are considered as good or better than what Massachusetts ever had. So we got the two best people in the area of English and mathematics that we could find. And we also had an additional guy in there, a researcher named Zeb Werman. He's a Silicon Valley engineer. He too had worked on the California math standards. So we got the best experts we could find. And what we had them do in these exhaustive 40–50 page papers was map out, we call them crosswalks. They went back and forth between all the high standard states like Massachusetts and Minnesota and California and Indiana and Texas against Common Core in both English and mathematics. And what are these exhaustive drafts? They looked at each one of the drafts of Common Core every step of the way. What they found is that every step of the way, Common Core was of lower academic quality than all the high standard states. So this was not going to be a race to the top. This was going to be a race to the middle, very clearly. Specifically, they ignored, that is, Common Core ignored the evidence from high standard states, specifically Massachusetts. They decided to cut classic literature, poetry, and drama. So all those things that I said really matter for the development of children in their reading and the shaping of their character. Those have been cut by 60%. So there's no Huckleberry Finn, there's no Sherlock Holmes, there's no Charles Dickens. By 12th grade, only 30% of what will be taught in the English class is going to be literature, poetry, or drama. Right? Even though the research and the data and evidence is very clear, both nationally and internationally, that this is the way you teach kids to read. Right? In the area of mathematics, they also ignored the evidence from all the high-performing Southeast Asian countries in California and Massachusetts, and they decided to, Common Core decided to move forward access to Algebra 1, not in 8th grade, the way the high standards states and countries had, but really early 10th grade. Right? So we're going to be a year or more behind our international competitors in mathematics. And then they used an experimental form of geometry that had never been successful in any place they'd ever tried it. And Common Core really tops out at really what they call Algebra 2 Light. There's no calculus, pre-calculus, anything like that. So if your child is interested in the STEM fields, Common Core is a path to nowhere. right? It's really what they call community college ready, not college and career ready, which is what they like to claim. These are standards that are not internationally benchmarked. They initially claimed that they were internationally benchmarked, and then we were asked to provide the countries that are benchmarked to us. Well, they're referenced by international competitors, so they're not. There wasn't any kind of international comparison. So then we decided to look at the next piece of it, because as I mentioned, people across the political spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, going back decades, everybody has known around K-12 education policy, as I mentioned at the beginning, that K-12 education is the responsibility, legally and financially, of state and local government. So we enlisted the former general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the previous into the second Bush administration, two highest-ranking lawyers in the federal government. And they mapped out in line and verse in a 40, 50-page paper with a lot of dispassionate details, the way only lawyers can do, is that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding, directing, validating, encouraging, cajoling, bullying the states and localities from adopting national standards, testing, and curriculum. Specifically, those laws are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. There's the General Education Provision Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon. There was the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself, and that was signed by Jimmy Carter. I think it's important to note that 2 of the 3 United States presidents that signed laws prohibiting the federal government from doing national standards, testing, and curriculum were Democrats. I'm not mentioning that by way of being partisan anyway. I'm just trying to show you that while some of the people that are in favor of Common Core say that the people that are against it are saying, oh, these people are extreme, they have extreme opinions. Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter were, hardly Tea Party presidents by any stretch of the imagination. There's a column that I put back there, but he's done 2 of them. George Will, the syndicated columnist, one of the best respected commentators on American politics and policy over the last 30 years, 35 years, has done two columns on the illegality connected to Common Core. And in one of them, he cited our research. So it's not just our opinions, it's not our lawyers, but a fairly well-regarded syndicated columnist who reaches about 30 million readers every week and has been doing so for 30-some-odd years. The next piece that we looked at is the cost, because the fact is that even though the Gates Foundation has pumped $200 million into the development of Common Core, and that 40-some-odd states have adopted, including our Massachusetts, the governors in these states, the legislature, the State Board of Education, the departments of education have not done any cost-benefit analysis. Maybe they figured that someone else is going to pick up the tab, and they're right about that. 90% of the funding is going to come from the state and local level, someone else is going to pay for it, so they can figure out what it's going to cost. We thought if you could take a look at what this might cost, and these kinds of national level budget projections are very difficult. I think the one that we came up with, and the guy who worked on it and his team had been worked in for U.S. Department of Education under both Republicans and Democrats, so he's sort of a bipartisan credentialing. He worked on some testing programs in a variety of different states. And the ballpark figure that he came up with, I think actually is a conservative estimate. I don't think it is a wild figure at all, is $16 billion, right? We know that in states like New York, which has a ballot initiative on the technology costs connected to Common Core, they're asking for just this year alone, they're asking for $2 billion more. That is far exceeds what we even projected they was going to cost over the whole course of several years. California's the same thing. They've asked for $3 billion in the first year. We thought it might be somewhere like $6 billion over the course of. So these states are just blowing through budgets to try to fund the technology, which is the biggest driver. Because of course, whether you're in the PARC testing the way Massachusetts is, or the Smarter Balance testing consortia the way California is that they ultimately want to move to that all the testing is done online. So again, technology cost, professional development for teachers, all new textbooks. So even in Chelmsford, if you bought new textbooks in 2009 or 2010, As soon as the Board of Education adopted the Common Core, all those textbooks basically have to be thrown away because they have to be aligned to a whole set of new standards. Teachers have to be retrained after all the successes on MCAS, all the successes with the previous standards. They've got to be tested and they've got to be trained on all new standards. So the next piece that we've looked at is the data mining or data collection. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about it because it really runs parallel to Common Core. It's not directly in the standards. But really what's happened is the same way that the federal government brushed aside the laws that they can't fund the testing, the national testing, which they've done, and they can't create federal incentives to have states adopt these standards, they've also brushed aside what they call FERPA laws, which are parent privacy laws. They've been around for decades, and they basically prevent the federal government from collecting personally identifiable data on children. What they did through the race to the top, though, the Obama administration, is that through the race to the top, they created incentives, what they call longitudinal data collection systems. So they're getting the states and these two federally funded testing consortia to collect the data that they're prohibited by law from collecting, and then the states will then turn it over to the feds. There's a paper that we did, just back a few months ago called Cogs in the Machine. You can find it on the Pioneer website. It's an 80-page paper. It's got 500 footnotes. It's written by two lawyers. They have gone into excruciating, dispassionate detail how really what we're looking at with Common Core is not really an education system. Remember I talked at the beginning about how the goal of the founders was to create a system of education that would create citizens, help establish and perpetuate the principles of our democracy. The outlook of Common Core and the data collection and the teacher evaluations and the national testing is really kind of a sorting process. They're trying to gather all this data, not just academic data, but data on children so they can begin to direct kids to careers. The way they do in a lot of other countries. I mean, they do this in Western Europe, right? Our immediate neighbors in Canada, right? This is a country we probably share the most in common with, is they don't even have a national Department of Education. They don't have national curriculum. They don't have national testing. They don't have national standards, all determined by their provinces, really the way we did in this country, right? And they outperform us. So it's not as though there aren't models that we have pretty close to us of something that we know works, and we know from Massachusetts that you can do this work. Massachusetts can do this work. New Hampshire can do this work. States can do this work. They just got to roll up their sleeves and take ownership of it. Now, the good news of all this is that from the beginning, Texas did what most states should have done. The Texas motto is "Don't mix with Texas." Well, they used this opportunity around Common Core to say, we're not doing Common Core, we're not doing race to the top, we're not doing national standards or testing or data collection, any of that stuff. The feds can keep their money, and guess what? We're going to get the best expert we can. We're going to get the people from Massachusetts and the people from California that develop these great standards, and we're going to have better standards than everybody. And that's exactly what they've done. And what you're seeing now is that more and more states, Oklahoma, Indiana, frankly states that have a lot less to lose than we did in Massachusetts, they are starting to pull out of Common Core. You're starting to see national polling data that are making it clear that parents with school-age kids, the general public, Republicans and independents mostly, are opposed to this. The name Common Core is toxic. The brand has been killed. And that really is through the efforts of people like Jenny White in Oklahoma, and it's people like Heather Crossan and Aaron Tuttle in Indianapolis, and a handful of moms in Salt Lake City, and a bunch of moms in Tallahassee. I mean, this is an instance in which we're providing the research on this. But really, the reason why this has gotten to be a big deal is because moms, and mostly moms, and grandmothers say enough. You can take our money, but you can't have our kids, right? And so that's the good news. The good news is that people are using this opportunity to get themselves educated about what's going on. They're putting together forums like this all over the country, and they're asking politicians of every stripe. I mean, this is not, I want to reiterate, this is not a partisan issue. The Obama administration is a big advocate for it. Jeb Bush has taken an enormous amount of money from the Gates Foundation to advocate for it. In almost every state where we've done testimony, had the pushback fighting the repeal. Jeb Bush is out there, and he's trotting it around, even though he comes from a state like Florida, which is a below-average performing state. He had no experience really in developing standards when in the 2 terms he was governor. You know, Chris Christie is for it. It's not a clear-cut partisan issue. But that's, I think, the thing that's been interesting about it is that people of a variety of different points of view are saying, look, enough with this. The same people, these Achieve Inc. and the Governor's Association, the Council of Chief State School Officer, the U.S. Department of Ed, the people that got us into this mess are not going to be the people to get us out. And we've had enough. So, again, you've been really patient. You've heard a lot of details. I know it's a ton of information. I appreciate your interest in it. And I want to thank Shannon and others again for setting this up. And I hope it's been helpful. Thanks.
We're going to be talking about the testing, and the reason we're going to be doing that is the Common Core system is actually based on high-stakes assessments. The children have to pass tests to be promoted or graduate. Teacher evaluation is based on these assessments, which is why they're called high stakes. There's actually something that's at risk in the assessments. And the state departments of education always say that these assessments are valid and reliable. Now, valid and reliable are just not words. They actually mean something in testing. And they mean the same thing whether you're talking about medical testing or whether we're in manufacturing or whether we're in education. Those words have accepted definitions in how we measure any person or product. Now, when I was in grad school, I actually worked in the testing clinic that the university held, both administering testing and teaching other people how to administer the test that we used in special ed for advanced placement and for IEPs. So I spent a lot of time in the evaluation area, and I'm appalled at what we see happen in these tests. So let's start with definitions and then look at how the tests do not measure up. Valid. Valid means, you shouldn't sit in the front, I'm going to use you as an example. I'll tell you. Valid means that I am testing what I say I'm testing and nothing else. The first type of validity is what's called construct validity. That means I eliminate extraneous factors, something that could mess up my result. If you think about how they test like a new drug or a new pharmaceutical device, the first thing that they do is they say you can volunteer to be a test subject, and you come in and you will have the most amazing physical that you ever had in your whole life. Because if you don't match the physical parameters, they're going to throw you out. My standing blood pressure is 90/60. People say, are you okay? Did you want to sit down? When I go for any kind of a physical. My husband fights to keep his blood pressure at the highest normal that you could make it. If we both went for the same, to volunteer for the same testing regimen, they would throw one or both of us out. Because there's such a difference between our blood pressures. They want everything to be the same. The second thing in medical testing is that if you go, they say we want you to show up anywhere from 72 hours to a week early. And then you live there. Why? So they know you didn't have 5 beers the night before the test. They know you got a good night's sleep. They know if we're testing something with sugar that your insulin regimen has been exactly correct for the week before the test. And you stay there so that they can monitor everything. So the only thing that will change is the thing that they're testing. Because the volunteer is what's called an extraneous factor. So in medicine we try to eliminate as much of the extraneousness as we can. Now let's move that to education. Children come in and they sit down to take a high-stakes test. Did they live there a week before that? No, they did not. When we were kids, one of my younger sisters, when she was 7, she had to take, the school we went to gave exams in January and at the end of the year. And after the January exams, the principal called my mother and said, I don't know what happened, she flunked. She flunked everything. We thought she was doing really, really well. We were really, I don't know how we missed it. You need to make an appointment and come in so that we can talk about this. So could you come like 2 days from now? And my mother, of course, said yes, was very concerned. And the next day, my mother called the school laughing and said, never mind. She broke out in the measles last night. She was sick when she took the test. But she was 7. So she didn't know to say, I don't really feel very well, so could I not take this test today? In any given testing population, some of the kids are going to be sick. But they're not, you won't know who they are. Perhaps there was an emotional upset. You know, your dog died last night? You're not going to take the test correctly. Perhaps there was an upheaval in your family. They're in the middle of a divorce, or there's a big argument, or you just have a huge family brouhaha. Perhaps something happened in your neighborhood. There was a fire up the street. A neighbor was sick and the ambulance came down the street with the lights flashing, going woo, woo, woo. Okay, all 7-year-olds are at the window. They're not sleeping. Perhaps they just couldn't really sleep. Perhaps they didn't get breakfast. In any given testing population, big, like a state, about 10% on average of the children have one of those extraneous factors. But you don't know which ones they are. So when you look at those test results, you have no way of knowing if little Johnny's results represent the fact that little Johnny actually couldn't do, or was little Johnny getting the flu. You don't know. But then we're going to base you said you were a teacher, we're going to base your evaluation on results that we don't know if they mean anything or not. Because were we testing the flu, or were we testing how well you taught? What we do know is that the lower the socioeconomic level of the child, the higher that percentage gets. Because children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to have had upheaval in their home the night before, or not have had breakfast, or not get a good night's rest. I work in a number of states, and I was in New York, and a teacher from Rochester, which is one of the poorest cities in New York, and their district doesn't do very well on these assessments. And one of the teachers stood up and said, I can't explain to you how ridiculous this is. I had a 6-year-old whose mother was shot in a drive-by shooting on her front porch, and you want her to take a test? How insane is that? On their surface, these tests are neither valid nor reliable, because there's no way to know or correct for the extraneous factors that the children themselves bring to the table. Now, is that new information? No. The National Research Council, which is a federal think tank, and they do studies in education all over the place, and they actually publish studies, and they have said that these tests do not give true measurements. We should certainly consider the test results, but since we don't know what the child brought to the table, we cannot take that as truth in measuring educational performance. Which is why when you were kids and you took either the Stanford or the Iowa or the Metropolitan or the California, it didn't count towards your grade, did it? Because if it didn't match everything else that happened, we considered the test, but then we looked at, okay, well, maybe the test isn't actually accurate, because it might not, in fact, be accurate. But in this system, we're evaluating children and teachers based on tests just like these. Now, it's really funny, we use the word discrimination a lot when we shouldn't use it. Here's a case where we should. These tests are at best meaningless, and at worst, discriminatory. Kids from poor districts will, of course, not do as well because of the extraneous factors impacting on the score of the test. Next, it's called formative validity. How well will these tests give me information that I need to make the children do better the next time? If you think back to the old achievement tests, what you got in your scoring was, you got a raw score. Little Johnny got 6 out of 10 correct. And then down on the side at the bottom, was usually on the right-hand side on the bottom of the page, it would say question number 1 was math, computation, addition. And Johnny got it right or wrong. That question number 2, math, computation, subtraction. And you got it right or wrong. So that teacher and parent could look at that score and say, oh, addition, correct, subtraction. Oh, we need to work on subtraction because little Johnny got all the subtraction problems wrong. Formative validity. I can do something with the information. But in these assessments, what do you get? You get the word proficient. What are you supposed to do with that information? Or you get not proficient. Well, what are you supposed to do with that information? In fact, in New York, the letter was originally written by 8 principals, and within just a few weeks, 530 principals in New York signed it. And one of the things they complained about in the test was that the test gave them no information to make the children do better on the test the next time. They got the word proficient, which is frankly meaningless. Then we have criterion validity. How well does this test match every other test? Either you can do your times tables or you can't do your times tables. So if I give you times table test 1 and you pass, and I give you times table test 2 and you don't pass, one of the tests is having a problem. The National Center for Education Statistics in 2008 actually published a graph. That's an arm of the federal government. And what they did was they took the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and they made a chart, and at the top was a brown bar. And the brown bar was, this is the achievement level that you would have to attain to be proficient in the NAEP. Under that was a dark blue bar. This is the level of achievement that you would have to attain to be basic in the NAEP. Basic is a C- to a D. You know, some understanding, but you're really not considered on target here. And anything below that was failing. And then they took where every state defined proficient in their state assessment. What did you have to do to be proficient? And they lined them up against the NAEP graph. Not one single state defined proficient at the level of achievement that the NAEP defined proficient. Not one. Only 8 states defined proficient at the level that the NAEP would call basic. And 42 states defined proficient below basic in the NAEP. And if you look at the state graph, you have Massachusetts was first. Massachusetts at the top, and then you have this like little, it kind of looks like this. Looks like a ski slope. So the states didn't agree with the NAEP, and the states didn't agree with each other. Well, either you are reading at 8th grade level or you aren't reading at 8th grade level. That means that they're not, the criterion isn't valid. They're manipulating it. The Nation at Risk, the document that you heard about, one of the things that they said was this minimum competency is not a good idea. Because a Nation at Risk said the minimum becomes the maximum and education for everyone goes down. Why did that happen? Because the federal government told the states, you have to set standards. No Child Left Behind said by the end of the last school year, 100% of the children had to be proficient. There were punishments if you weren't. There was no consequence whatsoever for one child being beyond proficient, not one. But the states could define proficient wherever they wanted. So what did that do? Stand up. Wiggle while you're up there. Okay, this is vocal performance. You can sit down when you meet my standard, but you cannot sit down until you meet my standard. Are you ready? Luciano Pavarotti. Anybody who can sing like Pavarotti can sit down. I want you to sing when you sit down too. Soloist with the New York Met. Chorus member with the New York Met. Soloist with the Regional Symphony. Really? No. Oh. Chorus member with the Regional Symphony. Soloist with the church choir. Sings in the church choir. This is a very unmusical group. Shower and enjoys it. Don't even sing in the shower. You can't carry a tune in a bucket. You can't sing anyway.
And you can sing in the church choir.
Oh, what's the
But
name?
you don't get more.
Oh, okay, well, that's fine. So now I'm a state. The federal government said by the close of they had 12 years from the time No Child Left Behind was passed until 100% of the children had to be proficient or there were punishments. I'm a state. Where am I going to set the standard in vocal performance? Where did you mostly sit down? At Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. So where is the standard going to be? At Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. I am a teacher in a classroom. I am not rewarded in any way for any child taking one step beyond that standard. Where am I going to spend all my time? If Mr. Can't Find the Bucket over there. Getting him up to Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. What about the child for whom the standard should have been Pavarotti? But see, when he walked into the classroom the very first day, he already could sing in the shower and enjoy it. So he already passed the test. So we don't have to pay any attention to him. And in fact, what the research shows is that when you have this kind of a model, the teachers focus immediately above, the students immediately above the standard, and immediately below the standard. They jettison the kids at the bottom because they'll never get there, so they're trying to cut their losses. And they ignore the children at the top because they already met the standard, so they will test as a success. But was education a success for that child? No. But it was a silent failure. The child for whom the standard should have been Pavarotti gets lost. And the research says those children report that there's a ceiling on the curriculum. And teachers have actually reported that they feel badly because they're forced to focus around the standard, ignoring the top and the bottom. And they don't know what to do about it. It's not the teacher's fault, it's the system's fault. The system put him or her there. And then said, well, you can manipulate the data. If we move it to healthcare, it gets really clear. Should we say that everybody should have a blood pressure of? Should everybody in this room have to have the same blood pressure? How ridiculous is that, right? Then why are we saying that every child has to learn the same thing to the same degree at the same time? Is it your ability to learn as unique as your blood pressure? And if we said to physicians, you're going to be punished if everybody doesn't meet the blood pressure standard, but you can set it wherever you want, where would they put it? At 340 over 280. Because then none of them would be punished. You can't blame the states for attempting to tell the federal government that they're accomplishing something that was impossible to begin. Criterion validity. Does my measurement match every other measurement? The state results don't match the NAEP and they don't match each other. I'm looking at time. Hang on one second.
You're good.
Oh, you're good.
Okay. Let's look at reliability. Reliability is how well does my measurement match all the other measurements. If I do it again and again and again and again and again, will I get the same number? Every morning you step on your bathroom scale, usually with some trepidation, most of us do. So get on the bathroom scale, it says 120. I feel really good about myself. And tomorrow I get on and it says 120. And the next day I get on and it says 120. And at the end of the week I have to go to see my doctor and he puts me on that stupid scale that has the real weights on it. And it doesn't say 120, does it? My bathroom scale was reliable. It said the same thing every day. It wasn't valid. It didn't match another measurement that I knew actually was valid. Did measure what it said it was going to measure. So you can be both valid and reliable. My scale says the same thing every day. When I went to the doctor's, the number was the same. My scale, and you've all had this, you get on your bathroom scale, 120, 120, 120, 175. No way did I gain 55 pounds in one day. Oh, I need to change the batteries in my bathroom scale. Not reliable. I got a different measurement. So when we look at these tests, one of the things we need to look at is, it's called a test-retest factor. If I test you on this information, and I come back 3 weeks later and give you another test on the information, whatever score you got, you should get. But these tests don't work like that. Because what happens is the curriculum, I know I'm making all the camera people crazy because I'm the curriculum narrows to the test. So what the research shows is when you start, the kids are here, and then as they take the test again and again, it goes up. But if you gave them a different test, it would go down again. Because what happens? The teachers know the test is high stakes. So they look at the test and they say to the kids, well, what did they ask you? I was in New York with another presenter who was a teacher, and he said, yeah, we knew that the New York Regents always asked about the Seneca Falls Convention, so every teacher of history always taught Seneca Falls because we knew it was going to be on every exam. That's called teaching to the test. And when the test is high stakes, the curriculum narrows right down to it. But it doesn't mean that the children have actually learned the content. It means they've learned the test. And if you change the test, the results are not carrying over. Because high stakes tests do not just narrow the focus on which children, they narrow the focus of the curriculum. In this system, we have what are called constructed response assessments in math. What is a constructed response assessment? The child is given a math problem. They're supposed to solve the problem and then they're supposed to write about it. So in the examples that I've seen in a variety of states, they all look obviously the problem is different, but they look the same. You can get anywhere up to 5 points. We'll use a 4-point scale just because it's easier. So here's a little problem. The child does the math correctly, they get 1 point. Second part of the problem, they do the math correctly, they get 1 point. Third part of the problem often involves a graph. They do the graph correctly, they get 1 point. Fourth part of the problem, I want you to write about why you did what you did and explain to me all the things that you did. And in the example, the child did all the math correctly, but didn't write about it sufficiently, and so they lost a point. They think it was just 1 point. There's only 4 points on the test. That's the difference between 100 and a 75. That's a big difference. So when you're adding up these points, you need to think about them in terms of percentages. So here we have this child who didn't write about it correctly, but they did all the math right. Is that a math test or a writing test? But we called it math. And the child who doesn't do well will get put in math remediation. Who doesn't do well? Boys. If you ask a girl to write an essay, she writes 2 pages, and she'll probably tell you what she had for breakfast, and she may tell you what color her socks are, and she'll put little heart circles over the eyes. I have 6 children. They are all girls except for 5 of them. 3 of my boys are engineers. If you asked any of my engineering sons, why did you do the math the way you did it, they would look at you and say, because that's the way it worked. And what they wouldn't write but would be thinking is, you dummy. What are you asking me that for? I wrote the math. What are you doing? Who else? ESL kids, who maybe could do the math because they had a really good math teacher, but even if they had a really good English teacher, it's still a second language to them. So maybe they're not able to explain themselves very well. Kids with learning disabilities. Learning disabilities are really kind of funny. You have like developmental delays that are generic, but you also have very specific disabilities in the special ed field. So you have children who are dyslexic with letters. You know, sometimes they flip, sometimes they swim, sometimes they flip words, sometimes they just can't make sense out of them, but really good with numbers. And then you have kids who are dyslexic with numbers, they just somehow can't get them around. My one daughter, who is a ballerina, I homeschooled her for high school. She would be the mathematical dyslexic. How do I know? She did a math problem for me. It was time. How long did it take you to do da-da-da? And she brought it back with a negative number. And I said, well, that's wrong. And she said, well, why would that be wrong? I said, honey, time doesn't go backwards. It doesn't. Can you get younger? And she still looked at me like I was from Mars. Numbers don't mean anything to her. They just don't. She's the girl who calls me in the grocery store and says, okay, it says 2 ounces, I want to double it. How many do I need to buy? Does she know 2 times 2 is 4? Yeah, she does. But does that mean anything to her brain? No, it does not. And her brothers, who are the engineers, laugh at her every day. And she's like, I don't care. So there's dyslexia in both sides. You can be literally dyslexic, that's hard to say, or numerically dyslexic. So LD kids who happen to be mathematically able but have a literary problem are not going to be able to write about why they did the math correctly, even though they did. But they're not going to get put in reading remediation. They're going to get put in math remediation. The test didn't test what it said it was going to test. And who else? Kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who often can do math, but standard English often eludes them. They're a little slower because it isn't spoken as well in their home, so they're usually a year or 2 behind because they didn't necessarily come from families, which I'm sure you did and you did and you did. Hey honey, let's read a book today. That didn't maybe happen in their home. So especially in the early grades, they're going to be behind. But we're going to not put them in writing remediation. We're going to put them in math remediation. Where do you get the time? In New York City, kids who didn't pass the test, 2.5 hours a day in remediation. Where did that come from? Music, art, maybe another foreign language. For a test that didn't even test what they said it was going to test. Constructed response assessments. So not valid. Are they reliable? You're given a scoring rubric. The child demonstrates a thorough understanding. The child demonstrates a good understanding. The child demonstrates a partial understanding. The child demonstrates a minimal understanding. The The child demonstrates no understanding. Exactly what is the difference between thorough and good? Exactly what is the difference between partial and minimal? The state departments of education do advertising. They bring people in for just a minimal amount of testing, and then they read all of these, given this little rubric, and they're supposed to read all of these thousands of responses and fit them in. Did you ever watch the Olympics on television? Did you ever watch the figure skating? 9 judges watch the same skater do the same performance at the same time and give it 9 different scores. And those 9 judges are themselves experts in their field. Yesterday I was in Maine, and after I did this, a little young man came up to me and he said, I was one of the people that they brought in to do this. I got a couple days of, here's the rubrics, and then I was sat in a room and told fit them in. He said, I never thought about the effect I was having on people's futures. He wasn't an expert. He was somebody who was looking for a job, and he got one. Even when there are experts. For some years, in my community, I was one of the forensics judges. You know how like the junior high and the high school kids have forensics competitions, that's debating, and they can debate, they can do readings, they can read poetry or prose, they can write their own speeches, they can do extemporaneous speeches, and then it's a big competition, and they bring in judges, and they can win awards, and eventually they can move through the ranks and come up with a scholarship. So it's kind of a cool thing for the kids. And I was one of the judges. Now, I'm sort of a martinet when it comes to grading. So I would say it was a 1 through 7 scale, and I don't know if you've ever heard junior high kids give a speech, but when junior high kids give a speech, a lot of them start their sentence and then they close their mouth. And then they really want you to know what they're saying. And then they get, and I was graded down for that. And some of the kids would stand there like this and go, and then he went to the store and he looked at what, then her eyes don't come off the ceiling and they're literally rocking and they're sing-songing. And I graded down for that too. And I would write on the paper, this is why I graded you down. And here are suggestions to help solve your problem the next time. Because after all, it's supposed to be an educational experience, so you wanted them to learn something. In one of these things, the woman sitting right beside me, I looked over, she gave every child a 7 in every category. And I said, really? And she said, well, you know, they're just little children, and isn't it nice that they're up here doing this? I said, you know, it's competition. But I want them all to feel good. Okay, but they're not learning anything. I want them to learn something. Okay, now how do you know if the person scoring your child's paper was Miss Martinet or Miss Loosey Goosey? Everybody gets the highest score. It's fine. I just want them to whatever. You have no way of knowing that. You don't know. And frankly, anybody who's ever scored a bunch of essay papers, the paper you scored first does not get scored the same way as the paper you scored last. And if you had a glass of wine, if all the children do well, you are more likely to forgive mistakes. If all the children do poorly, you get a little tenser as you go. And so the kid at the end gets a harsher grade than the kid at the beginning. Because human people are human people. If the handwriting is hard to read and it's the end of the day, they get a lower score. If you didn't like what the little one had to say, maybe you found his or her style or topic or point of view offensive, you're going to give them a lower score. The scorers are told, don't use grammatical biases. And in fact, when you look at the scoring rubrics, which I pulled from a number of states, they say, if the errors do not impact readability, don't score down for that. So if the paper said the letter B, the number 4, the letter U, the number 8, what did I just say? Did that impact readability if you saw that on a paper? That would get the highest score by their own standard. Human judgment definitionally is not reliable. And yet, you have no way of knowing who scored your child's paper, what time of the day it was, what their personal bias was, how well trained they were, and that score is going to impact their future and the teacher's future. In this system, what you have is testing mechanisms that don't work, and then we pretend that they do, and we base personal decisions, policy decisions, and funding decisions. It's like trying to make objective decisions on subjective data. Now, you're a park state. Park, for those who don't know, that's called the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. And when you go to their website, they tell you that all of their assessments are based on their Common Core aligned curriculum, and it's on their website. They give you a model curriculum, so you can look at it. So I did. By 4th grade, they have to learn the standard algorithm for addition and subtraction. Here in Massachusetts, and in my kids' schools in Pennsylvania, that was the 2nd grade objective. By 6th grade, they need to learn long division. That used to be 4th grade. But starting in 6th grade, the park allows them to use a calculator, so they don't really ever have to learn it at all. They just have to be able to punch in the numbers. In the writing assessment, they can use a spell checker. And the park test says that these are computer adaptive tests that will change in real time based on the child's answers to the tests. So if you got 3 wrong in a row, I can make the questions easier. You may not take the same test as the person sitting beside you, but nobody will know that. Nobody will know that. When people talk about Common Core, what they say is, well, this is to make it more rigorous. That's a lovely marketing word. But when you look at how the assessments are constructed, they're not rigorous. They're not valid. They're not reliable. They're also not independent. When one looks at assessment, the first thing that normal people say is the person doing the testing independent of the person implementing the program? If a doctor said, I have developed a cure for cancer, I tested it. Here's my results. I did really well. I want to take it to the market. Would you buy that drug? No. Of course not. In fact, the FDA has standards, the National Institute of Health has standards, and they say if we're testing, if we're doing a clinical trial, and you're one of the evaluators, you can't be related to anybody, you can't have a financial interest, you can't even be involved in a clinical trial over here that would be of a similar product, because it might color your results. If you're running a nonprofit, and you make over a certain amount of money, you have to have an independent audit done by a CPA. You can't just hire Johnny up the street, do an ad in the paper, bring him in for 3 weeks of training, and now he's grading. You have to have a real CPA who can't sit on your board, can't be your bookkeeper, can't be your treasurer, and can't be related to anybody in the organization. Because it has to be independent. But here in education, the state sets the standards, oversees the delivery of the curriculum, writes the assessment, scores the assessment, determines what is passing, and then reports on their own results. If you were a bank, would you give a business a loan based on that kind of information? Yet that's exactly the information that you as parents and taxpayers and teachers get in this system. It's a closed system. Which is why, when the kids get to college, we find out so many of them need remediation. Because it's the first external audit. If you want to fix it, step number 1 is to tell the federal government to go home. Education by bureaucrat does not work. We need education by educator. Just like, you want medical care from an actual physician. But in this system, we've taken the power out of the hands of the teachers. And we've taken the power out of the hands of the parents. We don't even have accurate information. I think the most hilarious was the state of Maryland. Their website actually says that in Maryland they got together and set the level of proficiency where every child could reach it. My kids went, wow, why didn't you send us to school there? We'd have passed everything. The second thing you need to do is put control back at the local level. And then make assessments actually mean something again. Make sure they're independent. Those old achievement tests you took actually were valid and reliable. They met all the standards we just talked about. And those companies are all still there. I was in Tennessee fighting about the part test with one of the several committees and legislators. Tennessee this year didn't give the PARC test, they gave the Iowa test instead. The PARC test, according to their website, costs $29.50 a head. I did the research for the folks in Tennessee because they asked me to, so I wound up calling the Iowa, it's Riverside Publisher who does the Iowa test, and I said, so, you know, if some state actually wanted to do this just for conversation purposes, how much would this cost per head? And the lady said, well, if you want the deluxe package, where we give you all of the data and all the research and all the extra, not just your scores, but how you compare, it's $9 a head. Wow, that's a big difference, isn't it? When you compare it. Pearson is involved with the PARC test. And Microsoft has just recently put out a press release saying, well, you know, to implement it, everybody's going to have the latest equipment and programming, because we're not going to be supporting our older programs, so everybody's going to have to move to Windows 8. And the press release actually says, and the Mac stuff just really won't do. And you wonder why Bill Gates is involved in this. Taxpayer funded, billions of dollars in revenue from every school in the country. You've heard I've been at this for a long time. When I first started, it was children. Now I have grandchildren who are involved. And people ask me, well, why do you keep at it? I'm an FBI, full-blooded Irish. There's no point in being Irish if you can't be more stubborn than everybody that you know. And so I just won't go away. And I know you won't either. The worst thing you can do is nothing. To say, oh, I'm so glad you're doing this. I'm going to go home and keep watching a football game. And the second worst thing you can do is give up. I guess, well, are we going to win? You know, we beat them in the 90s. We actually did win. We beat them back. We'll beat them back this time too. How do I know that? Because of how many moms are involved in this. It's women all over the country who are standing up. Now, it's been said that fathers will die for their children. God love the gentleman. That's true. Mothers will kill. And when the federal government decided to declare war on the children and grandchildren of America, they forgot that there were moms and grandmoms attached to everyone. This is a war the federal government is going to lose. How fast they lose depends entirely on you. I beg you, get involved and stay involved. Our kids don't have any other advocates. And thankfully, they don't need other advocates when their moms and dads have stepped up to the plate. Thank you very much.
So I hope you guys have really enjoyed that. You know, we still have some time if there are any questions that they can answer for you. And please go ahead.
I serve on the school committee, and I will tell you that there is a great deal of fear in the community among staff, I think, I mean, based on my interaction. And even within our school committee, to have this candid discussion. And I think there's always inevitably the fear that what will the wrath of the state do to funding in our district? What is the best way to ensure that this discussion remains candid and that we're able to inform many of the parents who don't ask the questions of what the Common Core standards mean or how they all evolved?
That's an excellent question. I worked with a mom in Pennsylvania, and her answer was really quite spectacular. She said, you know, I can't attack the whole entire thing, so I think like a mouse. Which of these strings can I bite through? Because then it'll start to unravel. So pick the string that floats your boat. Maybe your string is that Massachusetts was first in the nation, and why are we moving down? Which is a question. When you frame it, if I tell you something, you'll listen. If I ask you something, your mind will immediately, because they're like computers, your mind will try to figure out the answer. Make your stuff questions. Take it down. Well now, how do we know this test is valid? How do we know it's reliable? Who's getting the data? All of those things, I'm looking at constructive response. Now, how do I know who graded my kid's test? Specific questions. If you go through the videos or you look at presentations like Jamie gives, they're all going to, everyone, you'll all get a different one because everybody's mind is a little different. Ask questions, specific, and keep asking till you get an answer, because there aren't any. There just aren't any answers. Who pays for this is a really good question. Bill Gates, he's actually quoted, he went to Harvard and said that we would have to do it for 10 years before we know if it works. So the principal funder, but his children go to a school that doesn't do Common Core. So why is it okay for Mr. Gates to fund experimenting on our children, but not his children? Like, those are the kind of questions that make people's brains go around. So the more, you'll think of this in terms of specific questions you can ask, because it makes people think of the answers.
And I guess I'd add on to that too. So if you're asking folks questions, start with, political candidates. It doesn't matter if they're Republicans and Democrats, independents, what have you. It doesn't matter if they're running for school committee or if they're running for governor or state senate or what have you. The state spends an enormous amount of money at this, and we spend an enormous money at the local level too, every year on K-12 education. Politicians, doesn't matter what party, they should be able to answer some of these questions. I mean, I don't always agree with a lot of what Chris Christie says, especially as it relates to Common Core because he's in favor. But the truth of it with it, he's right about this one. You get education wrong, forget it. There's all the other things are you're trying to put the horses back in the barn. You got to get this one right, and all politicians need to be able to answer these kinds of questions. They should, given the amount of money that we're spending on it, given the preciousness of our children and the importance of this for our democracy and for our economy and for the lives of our communities, they should be able to answer these kinds of questions. And if they can't, and can't give you a satisfactory answer, you either don't want to vote for them or you want to keep pressing them to make them answer the questions.
Exactly. People say I don't want to be involved in politics. Politics is involved with you. You can't choose not to be involved in politics. You can choose to be involved as a sheep, or you can choose to be involved as a citizen. Those are your only two choices.
Just to add what was said, CommonCoreForum.org is getting behind legislation to be filed next January. That is going to do several things, cost-benefit analysis, and get behind the legislators that have pushed that already. We're going to push for a 24 or 36-month pause on PARC, which is what the MTA is calling for. So there is a coalition, political coalition growing on this. Other issues in legislation we're looking to file is, are there going to be any accommodations for special education? There are numerous things that the state must come back and answer for us, and like our speakers said, this should be answered in the public sphere. The other thing, I'm a high school social studies teacher, taught at Acton, Boxborough. In our system of federalism, Jamie would like this since he likes history too, we have to attack this both from the top and the bottom. So that means our state has to be more accountable and our federal government has to be more accountable. The bottom line is it's going to take both approaches, in my opinion, to roll this back and go back to what was working swimmingly well. It wasn't perfect, but it was far better because you had local input. I mean, just to underscore what Jamie said earlier, this was passed in the middle of the summer without a public hearing, without legislators impacting it. Like, they voted on the 93 Ed Reform Act. That was not the case this time. And one last thing. We have governors that are stepping forward across the country suing the federal government because at the end of the day, this is a violation of the 10th Amendment. That the powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the people in the states. So they have no business doing this. So there are a host of things. I think what it's made your school committee job harder. And what this has done is really put all of you on the hot seat because you're in limbo. And it's not going to get quieter, it's going to get louder. And so now's the time to keep doing what we're doing, and that's the reason why we formed this organization. And thank you to Sandy and our speakers for coming out.